Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Elemendorf, thank you for your indispensable staff and your personal responsiveness to our questions and your input, and for being here today. I've got so much I want to ask you about and so little time, so I'm going to go quickly here. I want to focus on three things. One, of course, is what the real problem is in the deficit, and I think your new report only emphasizes what we already knew. Second is what can we do on growth, and then third is what is the impact of Obamacare on growth. In terms of the deficits, this was a discouraging report for me because it shows things are getting even worse. If you could give me just a series of quick yes or no answers, that'd be great. Am I correct that in the past 50 years, federal revenues have averaged just under 18% of GDP?
Senator, we report averages for 40 years, and we say it's been about 17.5%.
Okay, yet less than 18% over the last 40 years. Over the next decade, you're projected that it will average more than 18% of GDP. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're saying it'll keep rising thereafter?
Under current law, yes.
Okay. So the notion earlier we talked about, that we need more revenue. We're above the historic average based on your projections over the next 10 years and continuing to grow. How about discretionary spending and what we call other mandatory spending? Are those falling as a percent of the economy over the long term?
Yes, under current law, Senator, and
okay.
the projection rules.
So what's left? Discretionary spending is what we appropriate here every year. Other mandatory is part of the 2/3 of the budget is mandatory. Social Security, health entitlements, 7.8% of GDP in 2005, now 9.7% of GDP, on their way to 13.7% of GDP in the next 20 years. Is that correct?
That sounds right, Senator.
And you project that health entitlements alone are going to go up over 100%, more than double, 115% in the next 10 years now. Is that right?
The spending for the major healthcare programs we project to rise from 4.8% of GDP this year to 6.1% in 2024.
In nominal terms.
You're referring to a nominal.
In nominal terms, you go 115% over the next 10 years.
I take your word for it, Senator.
Okay. Steeply rising national debt and its resulting interest costs are mostly the result of what? Borrowing for what specific programs?
Well, the borrowing is for the gap between spending and revenues,
right,
Senator. But the part of the budget which is
we just talked about the fact that
growing most substantially is spending for Social Security and the major health care program.
Okay. So we have identified what the focus ought to be. We're heading toward record high tax revenues over the decade, nearly record low discretionary spending, falling other mandatory spending. So we're talking about these important programs, but unsustainable in their current form, health care entitlements, Social Security, and the resulting net interest costs. Is that correct?
There's a striking shift in the composition of government spending toward those few large programs you've highlighted, Senator, yes, and away from other things.
So the next question is, how do you solve that? Obviously, we need reforms. Again, incredibly important programs, but we've heard a lot about a balanced solution, which basically is to make the next generation pay the cost for our generation, as opposed to reforming these programs. So that is very clear in your report. This is the problem. We've got to address it, and if we don't, we will face consequences you talked about earlier, including the possibility of a fiscal crisis. Second, the economy. I found it depressing, actually, what you put out in your report. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that you're asking us to accept a new normal, and that new normal is not 4 or 5% growth, it's 2% growth. In fact, what you tell us is that in this new baseline, you pared back your economic growth assumptions, which, by the way, have always been more optimistic than what actually happened in the last several years, and so I understand why you did it. 2.5% over the next decade, decelerating to just 2% in 2024. $1.4 trillion less tax revenue, therefore, over the next decade. And, this is not the first time this has happened. Since, again, President Obama took office, you have consistently come out with decreases in projected economic growth. Those have translated just in this president's term to more than $2.2 trillion in reduced tax revenue when you take those projections out to 2024. So and remember, this is all about the bad economy since the president took office. So earlier you talked about this, but economic growth obviously is key. Restraining the spending, reforming this growth, we need it. Economic growth through tax reform, would that make sense, lowering the rate and broadening the base?
That would be good for the economy, Senator.
How about trade?
Depends on the specifics of the reform.
Yeah. Would trade be good for the economy, expanding trade?
Yes, it probably would be, Senator. Again,
okay. Trade promotion authority is before us right now. How about long-term debt reduction through the reforms we've talked about?
That would be good for the economy.
That would be good for the economy. So there's three things.
Senator.
How about more domestic energy production?
I think that would be good for the economy as well.
This is what's frustrating is we've got these things that you know would work and we know would work, and if we would just do them, we could both deal with the spending side and the growth side. On Obamacare, just quickly, I appreciate you've looked at the work of Casey Mulligan and others, University of Chicago. There's been a lot of talk about this today. people are leaving the workforce because of this sharp cliff. I would say to my colleagues on the side who said, you know, this is all about moms who want to stay home with their kids, and it's all about people starting new businesses or even working in their family businesses. I mean, if you're working, then you're not out of the workforce first. But tell us the demographics of this group that's likely to drop out. What do you know about them?
The attributes of the group?
Yeah.
So the biggest effects, as we wrote, Senator, are primarily on people of lower income because they are the ones who are receiving the subsidies through the Affordable Care Act. And
Yeah.
it's the existence of the subsidies and the withdrawal as people's income rises that reduces the incentive to work.
So as Mulligan says, about a 50% in effect tax or penalty on work because of this cliff. But tell us who these folks are. Do you think it is primarily people who are liking to retire early or moms who want to stay home with their kids? Who is it? Yeah. And I ask you this because when you look at the labor participation rate, which is already at 1970s levels, it's a record low for men right now. It's a record low for working men. And here we are taking this labor participation rate even lower, fewer people working, which is bad for the economy, it's bad for growth, it's bad for prosperity. When you look at this data that we know out there, and the early indications are this tends to be single men, they tend to be childless, and my concern is we're going to even exacerbate further this already record level. What do you think about that?
So, Senator, the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act affect a broad range of types of people, and we did not do this analysis in a way that lets us isolate the effects on particular.
Could you look at the Brookings study on that and look at whatever else you think is appropriate and get back to me on that as to who you think really is going to be affected here? We talked about the fact that these are people who you want to get on that ladder of opportunity, that income ladder, and moving up on the ladder, and this takes them off the ladder, reduces their Social Security benefits, as you know, because their lifetime earnings are going to be reduced. It takes them out of this possibility of being able to achieve their dream for themselves and their families because they lose, again, the dignity and self-respect and the opportunity that comes with work. And that's my concern, is that I know you and I disagree on some of the Obamacare impacts on the labor demand side. I think that $1 trillion in new taxes does have an effect on workers. I think also the 50-person limit and the part-time at 30 hours does have an effect. We may disagree on some of that. But this data is really concerning because it exacerbates an already terrible problem we have. And you don't have to do it. You can solve these health care problems without that stiff cliff. And that's one of the differences maybe between the two sides here, is that there are ways to do it, including through the tax code, that have been talked about where you wouldn't have that 50% penalty and still be able to address many of the problems on pre-existing conditions and other issues that have been raised today. I'm over my time. Thank you, Madam Chair, for your indulgence. Thank you, Dr.